So that gives us some insight into how we ought to preach. Now, I don't believe that it's wrong to have different preaching styles. I think Peter probably preached differently than Paul, and you and I may preach differently, those of you who are preachers, and that I think God can use different styles to reach different people. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I do think that we ought to note Paul's style because it is endorsed by Scripture, and we ought to at least use it sometimes, where we ought to use an approach to it, part of it, in every lesson. We should include reasoning, we should open the scriptures, and we should make our arguments or our points out of the scriptures. Paul went down to the river and he preached to Lydia. He didn't have a synagogue to go to. Lydia was a practicing Jew, but she didn't have a synagogue. She just had an outdoor location, evidently, to say her prayers for her Sabbath observance. That gets us to verse 2, Paul's manner. I'll give you a sermon on that momentarily, but I wanted to see these big picture Paul's preaching style first. You could say that this is a 3-week gospel meeting. He preached for 3 Sabbath days in the synagogue in Thessalonica. We used to have 3-week gospel meetings, not in my time, but before me. I've heard people talk about it, and I have preached in a 4-week gospel meeting, but it was a different speaker each week. I just preached 1 full week of that gospel meeting, which is pretty amazing. And I've done others that were a full week long, but that's the only one I've ever done that continued after I went on. Somebody else came in and preached. But here, Paul was preacher in all 3 weeks. So you see Paul's preaching style in these 2 verses. He reasoned, he opened the scriptures, he made his arguments from the Bible, alleging. So Paul's approach to preaching was intellectual. He was passionate, but these are all intellectual ideas. So that gives us some insight into how we ought to preach. Now, I don't believe that it's wrong to have different preaching styles. I think Peter probably preached differently than Paul, and you and I may preach differently, those of you who are preachers, and that I think God can use different styles to reach different people. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I do think that we ought to note Paul's style because it is endorsed by Scripture, and we ought to at least use it sometimes, where we ought to use an approach to it, part of it, in every lesson. We should include reasoning, we should open the scriptures, and we should make our arguments or our points out of the scriptures. And then I see verse 17, you see there on alleging, and we're not going to do that, but you can make a note to do that on your own. Now, I'll also notice before I give you that sermon that it mentions that this Jesus, that's his name. The Pharisees would have called him Jesus. That was his name. But they would not have called him Christ. They wouldn't have said Jesus Christ like we do. They would have only said Jesus of Nazareth because that's his name. They did not believe he was Christ because that's his title. So Paul is alleging that Jesus, whom I preach unto you, is Christ. He is the Messiah. I think that is sometimes lost on audiences today because we are in a different time in history and people are just used to those. They think of it like a first and last name, but it's not. It's like President Trump or President Biden. It's a title with a name. So I think that's all I'll give you on that. But let's move over. I'll just give you this to you quickly. It's not directly related to Thessalonians, but Paul's habits, as his manner was, this text says. So his manner was to go to the synagogue, go where religious people were. They weren't his religion anymore. They were Jews. But he went there because that gave him a good opportunity to talk about Jesus with people that had a background in monotheism and in prophecy. So they were prepared, Galatians 3:26-27, to receive the gospel, more so than a pagan was. A pagan might be more eager for it, but the Jews were more ready for it. The second thing, he engaged in religious discussions. So we're seeing a pattern here for today. not synagogues necessarily, but place where religious people are. And that can even be an online space. Number 3, he reasoned with others from the scriptures. So we ought to reason not from human reasoning, not from our own wisdom, but from the scriptures. Like this verse says, what do you think this verse means? So get people into the Bible. If they want to argue, let them argue with the Bible and not argue with us, because we don't matter, but the scriptures do. So get them, so tell me, what do you think this scripture means? And then, well, I don't agree with that scripture. Okay, but it's scripture, right? So realize that you're arguing with God if you don't agree with scripture. Then number 4, he preached the deity and resurrection of Christ. And we ought to do the same. I think that, there was a time when most people believed in the deity and the resurrection of Christ, but if I'm reading the situation right, people are moving away from that. Younger people are moving away from, well, I'm not really sure about that virgin birth thing. I'm not really sure he lived a whole lifetime and never sinned, maybe, but I don't know about that. So there's some doubt. And the resurrection, was it a bodily resurrection? Was it a metaphorical? So we need to emphasize this perhaps more than we have in our lifetime. Now, the next thing I'll notice is in verse 4 is the reception to the gospel in Thessalonica. Some of them believed, so that's good, and consorted with Paul and Silas. That's King James. What does your translation have if you're using a different one in verse 4? Consorted, or after it says some believed.
ESV says joined.
Joined, okay. Anybody else have a different one?
No, NASB says the same.
Mm-hmm. All right. I looked this up in the interlinear, and one of the choices was "were obedient." I really like that. You might want to study that more before you preach it and get your facts down cold. But joined is similar to King James, consorted, interacting with each other. But if it does include obedience in that word, then that gives us another passage, and this would not be the only one, of course, but gives us another passage that shows the kind of faith that the New Testament rewards, or that God rewards. It's not just a mental assent kind of faith, but an obedient faith, a submissive faith. And that might be another passage to use in those kind of sermons. Consorted with Paul and Silas, and of the devout Greeks, a great multitude. So these would be pagans or Gentiles, and the chief women, not a few. Those may have been Jewish. There's a synagogue there, and he's at a synagogue. So it seems that some of the Jews are believing, and maybe these chief women are a mixture of the two, but it's a mixed audience in that church from the get-go. Some Jews, some Gentiles. So you see the middle wall of partition has come down between the two groups, and now they are in the same location.